who's a peer. Thanks, Sal. So Miloš is a peer researcher from Euro Youth Mental Health, and he's been working with us on these studies and will be presenting some of the work alongside me. Also joined by Inga, I think, who is another peer researcher who's worked with us on these projects. And we're joined by Sally, who is our regional officer and who is helping us with anything else we might need in this session. I have to start with an apology. So I've got a really bad cough. And so what we had decided to do is to pre-record me talking to the slides so that we're not interrupted by this horrible cough. So I'm going to play the recording in PowerPoint, and then I shall pause for Miloš to present his slides. And as my slides were pre-recorded before today, and I'm talking about the active ingredients work that Miranda's spoken about, there may be some slight overlap, but not much. As you heard, the session is being recorded. However, if there are any questions, we will pause the recording to allow for the questions and discussions. And we're hoping to have probably about 5 or 10 minutes at the end for any questions and reflections. So I'm going to share my screen and get this pre-recording playing. Please make sure you've got the sound on your computers turned up for it.
So we're going to be talking about 2 active ingredients projects which explore how best to support young people experiencing anxiety and depression. Wellcome Trust pulled together a list of 26 active ingredients that groups of researchers thought might help young people aged 14 to 24 years who experience depression and anxiety. They then worked with these groups of researchers around the world to find all the evidence which speaks to whether these specific active ingredients work for young people or not. But from a wider perspective, they also wanted to know what young people and mental health professionals thought about those ingredients. So did the existing list look right? Was there anything missing? And questions like that. And so for these studies that we're going to be talking about today, they are specifically for young people who experience depression and anxiety, who are aged between 14 to 24, and the active ingredients are looking to both prevent and intervene once young people are experiencing the difficulties. And the Wellcome Trust have come up with a cooking analogy which they've been using to try to make the description of these active ingredients and what they're trying to do more accessible. So the analogy goes like this. So when cooking something, we need to use the right ingredients for the dish, but different people might use different ingredients because of what they dislike, or because what's available to them, or because of their culture. This is true for depression and anxiety as well. So there are a lot of ingredients that could help, and some people may like or use some ingredients more than others. Okay, so we're going to be talking about this project first, which is an international qualitative study on the views of young people and stakeholders on the active ingredients of mental health support. And listed on this slide are the colleagues who worked with us on this project. It was a 5-month project which ran from autumn 2020 to early 2021. So as mentioned, Wellcome had pulled together this list of active ingredients which may help young people aged between 14 and 24 who experience anxiety and or depression. And small groups of researchers proposed these active ingredients as the best bets for helping young people. And this was based on their experience, knowledge and research in these areas. The team at Wellcome knew that the list was not definitive or fully complete, and they wanted the help of young people and mental health professionals to find out other ingredients that could be added to the list, whether some could be refined or even removed. And you can see here the original list shown in this table consisted of 26 active ingredients, and they're organised here into potentially relevant for both preventing difficulties from arising and helping once they have arisen, for just prevention and for just intervention. The majority were identified as potentially helpful for both anxiety and depression, as you can see here, whilst a few others were identified as only potentially helpful for depression, such as better sleep and body clocks, increased financial resources, and improved view of self. There were two that were identified as potentially helpful for anxiety, and those were reduced avoidance of feared things and better gut microbiome function. So the aims of this study were to find out and explore what young people and professionals think about that list of 26 active ingredients, whether there were any active ingredients to remove, whether there were cultural differences across different countries, what active ingredients were the most and least helpful, and whether we could organise the list in a better way to make it more accessible. So key aspects of this first study. We held a number of country-specific focus groups in 8 countries, but we also organised cross-country focus groups to bring participants from different countries together to reflect on the findings that were emerging when we shared with them this list and asked those questions that speak to the aims. So we spoke to 120 young people and more than 60 professionals who were clinicians, researchers and policymakers over the course of this study. We worked with local partner organisations to recruit people to take part in these focus groups, and for the most part those local organisations were NGOs. We had to adapt to country circumstances, so for example language. Some focus groups were held in local languages with English interpreters, and others were held in English. And of course, the COVID pandemic, so all of our focus groups were conducted online. And we found that this actually helped us to access some groups of young people and professionals that we just wouldn't have been able to access very easily before we had to conduct our research online. And central to our research was the involvement of peer researchers and peer advisors, and Milos is going to talk a bit about that.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Zoom decided to block my camera. I apologize for that. Anyhow, yeah, as Jenna was mentioning, in this project we had the peer researchers, which were representatives of Youth Mental Health, and those were my colleague Inga and myself. And we were included in the research team together with Jenna and other members of CORC team. And we were helping them to coordinate the project and to direct the activities. On the other hand, we had the peer advisors, which were representatives and or volunteers of the partner organizations that Jenna just mentioned. So those people were our contacts at the local level and helping us recruit both young people, especially young people, but also professionals, organizing those sessions, serving as a contact point, supporting young people during, but also before and after focus groups in case any things or materials were triggering for them. So they were really valuable part of the project because they were the ones working on the local level. And also, as Jenna mentioned, we had 120 young people who participated in focus groups, and they gave us some valuable input that we used in other activities.
So in terms of the findings,
Sorry, I'm having some slide issues. Bear with me, my apologies.
So in terms of the findings, based on the discussions at the focus groups that we held across those 8 countries, the majority of the original active ingredients were reworded. Now, it's important to note here that the original wording was proposed by researchers, and so perhaps it makes sense that clinicians and young people might suggest alternative wording. There were some concepts that didn't make sense to young people and professionals. So, for example, the gut microbiome one and the one which was about reducing inflammation in the body, they just didn't make sense. There were also words that could not easily be translated into other languages because the equivalent terms just don't exist to reflect these constructs. So such as perfectionism and self-compassion were key ones that came up, where people were just saying to us, there's nothing that's equitable in the local language. And another one was that words such as better, positive, negative, improved or reduced did not feel helpful to young people. And they raised questions such as who decides whether an activity is positive or negative, and who decides whether a young person needs to develop better thought processes. And it was determined that individual circumstances may strongly influence whether an activity or psychosocial state needed to be improved or reduced. So this is a key thing that came out of the research and our findings, was this idea of personalization, and one thing being helpful to one person doesn't necessarily mean that it will be helpful to someone else. So we ended up adding 39 active ingredients to the list, which reflected the feedback from young people and the professionals. I won't go through all of them, but some of them, just to give you a bit of a flavour of the new ones that came up, are feeling understood and accepted by family and friends, taking time to learn and understand yourself, awareness and education about depression and anxiety, relationships with family, and practicing religious or spiritual beliefs. Okay, so there were a few cultural differences that were mentioned by young people and professionals who were located in different countries, and we're just giving you a flavour of them here. So in Kenya and India, they spoke a lot about the stigma around the use of antidepressants. In Brazil, they spoke a lot about neighbourhood cohesion being unrealistic. So that just wasn't really a thing. That's not how, in their experience, that's not how they were living. And in South Africa even, and Pakistan, religion was something that came up as a really key and important active ingredient. And as I mentioned, so preferences based on individual young people were really coming out as much stronger than any differences that we found across countries. So that was quite curious to us as the researchers who conducted this study, because we really thought and expected at the start of the research that there would be real differences across countries, and we had imagined that we would have potentially lists of active ingredients for different countries, and that's just not how this played out, and it's not what people were saying to us. It was much more about differences on the person level as opposed to on the country level, although there were some things that were spoken about more or less in different countries, and people thought would be more helpful based on their culture and the country. So although a large number of contextual active ingredients were added by participants to the initial list, both young people and professionals felt that active ingredients over which they tend to have greater control were seen as the most helpful to support anxiety and depression. And so those active ingredients were ones such as learning problem-solving skills, the ability to shift perspective, developing new thinking patterns and understanding thinking patterns better, regulating or managing emotions, and meaningful social connections. So all of those ones that you might attribute to, you know, on a person level, able to affect change. So I'm just bringing this slide back up briefly to remind ourselves what the original list of the 26 active ingredients looked like. And in our research, the active ingredients were grouped following a thematic approach because feedback from the participants indicated that distinctions between anxiety and depression and between prevention and intervention may be arbitrary. So we specifically asked them about that, and they didn't feel like it was really important to have certain active ingredients that were for depression and others that were for anxiety. They just wanted to talk about them all sort of together. And also they didn't want to make any distinctions necessarily between prevention and intervention. And I think that this loops us back to thinking about active ingredients that are important and effective at the individual level, as opposed to grouping them for certain groups or certain countries. So we determined, based on our findings and our discussions, that it may therefore be helpful to tailor the list of active ingredients according to individual specific preferences and needs. Yes, taking us back to that original idea of potentially having different lists for different countries. We went back on that entirely. So this is the ecosystem type of model that we came up with based on the thematic ordering of the longer list of our 65 active ingredients. And you can see here that it starts at the bottom with the active ingredients that are most central to the person, so are to do with understanding and accepting oneself. Then as we move up the model, the active ingredients move away from being centralised within the person to being to do with how we interact with others. So, for example, understanding and acceptance from others, and then on to society and the environment as themes. So one of our tasks of this study was to make recommendations to Wellcome. And so our recommendations were broadly to use one list of themes and ingredients globally, with the option for young people to make the list fit for them. Individual young people should be able to decide what active ingredients they use. So this is about personal preferences and the young person leading what they feel might be helpful to them. And that young people are key to ensure that other young people and professionals can use the list effectively. So we were thinking about young people mentoring other young people in thinking about these active ingredients and thinking about what might help each other, and saying these are the sorts of things that helped me. However, there's this big list of active ingredients that researchers and other young people and professionals feel might help as well. Ultimately, our hope is that the revised list of active ingredients will help young people to build their own recipes to tackle depression and anxiety. But our feeling is that having a recipe and being able to cook the dish are two different things. And next, we want to be able to give young people, families and communities the tools they need to use these active ingredients. So there's one thing, and I suppose this is the first stage, and this is the work that Wellcome are commissioning people to do, is to figure out what helps and what doesn't help, and then providing young people, families and communities with the list. But then there's another stage, and that's giving people the tools that they need to be able to use these active ingredients, to be able to put these things into practice in everyday life. And that's where this ecosystem model that we created comes into play. And we hope that it's a useful way for the active ingredients to be organised, to be easily identified and sorted through, and just to make finding and thinking about them a bit easier. And we hope to create an interactive version of this model which would sit online somewhere and would provide more detail about these active ingredients, and young people and professionals could click through. So they would click on one of those bands or circles on the ecosystem, and then within there it would show all of the active ingredients that we were able to sort into that theme, and then they would click through further and find even more information about that. So finally, on this study, it's just to say many thanks to all of the peer advisors and the participants who contributed to the study, and we've named the organisations that we worked with in the various countries. So moving on to talking about the second study. So this study is collaborative goal setting, what works for whom in the therapeutic relationship. So in our international focus groups in the first study that I just have talked us through, young people discussed the facilitative nature of breaking things down and having a few goals per day, which they saw as important factors that might help them. The original active ingredient was called being hopeful. Now, young people who we spoke to in those focus groups suggested that this should be expanded to have a clear focus on short and long-term goals. And so the young people that we spoke to said that to set small goals that gradually make you feel better was a significant factor to them as being helpful. And it was this pivotal feedback which underpinned the reason that we chose to focus on this area. So we applied to Wellcome to focus on this area, to conduct a study, and Wellcome funded us again for 5 months to conduct this research. And this project ran from summer 2021 to having just finished the project this month. It's important for me to note just here that these findings are so hot off the press that we've received permission to share the findings with you here today. But after that, there'll be a delay before these slides will be made available until we've received sign-off on everything. So just to give you a bit more background and what sort of form these research questions. So we started to wonder a bit about the interplay between goals and goal setting and goal tracking and therapeutic relationships. And this was given that from our knowledge and experience, we know that goals are considered to be a main part of therapeutic relationships, and that therapeutic relationships are considered to be a key driver in positive mental health outcomes. Research suggests also that collaborative goal setting can be crucial to help focus young people's therapeutic work and is central to shared decision making, which leads to agreements between practitioners and young people on the best ways forward. In our experience, the research that we'd come across relating to the use of goals in young people's therapeutic settings was overwhelmingly positive. And our curiosity was piqued in 2 ways. So first of all, we were wondering, why is goal setting and working on goals with young people, why is that so effective? Why is all of this research so positive? But then the second thing that we were wondering about is that it can't be effective for everybody. And so for whom is it not so helpful, and when, you know, and under what circumstances is it actually not very helpful for young people? And because of this, a key aim of the study was to explore the research gaps relating to understanding these nuances of for whom and why not. So the research question is collaborative goal setting. So that's where goals are set with the practitioner and the young person. So is that a helpful or unhelpful element of the relationship, the working relationship between the practitioner and the young person? And so yes, our nuanced questions. So for whom? Is that effective and not effective? Why not? And under what circumstances? We followed a mixed methods approach consisting of online database searches for published and unpublished studies and documents, as well as a review of potentially relevant websites. And we coupled that with consultation with advisors who were young people with lived experience of anxiety and or depression and therapy, and mental health professionals in the field who were academics and clinicians who had experience of working with or researching goals within this context. So the experts by experience, Milos is going to talk us through that now.
Yes, so in this project, we had 8 young people with lived experience of anxiety and depression and of using the therapeutic services, as Jana just mentioned, and they are based in Brazil, Pakistan, Turkey, Spain, and the UK. So you can see that there is a bit of an overlap with the participants of the previous project that we just mentioned. And in terms of gender, we had 5 females and 3 males, including people who identify themselves as transgender. When it comes to clinicians and researchers working in the field, they are based in Norway and the UK, and there we had 1 female and 5 males. And finally, we had the same 2 peer researchers who are based in Germany and Belgium. Peer researchers were embedded in the team, and they led the liaison with the youth advisory group members, chaired the meetings, inputted into documents, so they had different roles. And one of the most important ones was directing discussions at 6 advisory group meetings. So we held 2 meetings with professionals and 4 with young peoples, and we decided to approach them separately so that young people don't feel good for to share their experience in front of professionals, or so they're not judged in any way. And just to give you some examples of the questions that we were asking to them, those were: is the goal settings important part of the relationship with your therapist? Why or why not? Are these findings that we found through the literature research aligning with your experience, or is there anything else that is missing or hasn't been considered? Then are there any elements of the findings that don't match your experience? And how do you interpret and how do you understand these experiences within the context of your own experience?
In terms of the findings from this study, so we conducted this literature review online, and we reviewed over 10,000 articles that were returned from our search and sources of information, so looking through websites, documents that were on web pages. And the resultant sample of relevant articles was 7. We reviewed the findings with the advisory group to help us understand and ground the findings in lived experience. And so we split the findings out into those nuances of the research question. So what works? So the advisory group and all 7 included studies agreed or suggested that collaborative goal setting is a helpful element of the therapeutic relationship for young people who experience anxiety or depression, and more broadly with other presenting difficulties as well. So that wasn't such a surprise for us, but it was useful, I think, for us to be able to explore all of that literature and all of those sources of information to be able to distill this message within. So in terms of the mechanisms, so the why and why not. So goal setting is helpful to young people experiencing anxiety or depression because it supports open communication, building trust, and enables young people to feel supportive and to have ownership of their care. However, we also found that language and power dynamics were key, and that reviewing progress towards goals too frequently may give young people the impression that practitioners are more interested in gauging their own success, and ratings may become meaningless, therefore. And while some youth advisors said that collaborative goal setting was helpful for them to build trusting relationships with practitioners, Some youth advisors also said that trust needed to be established first, and that they couldn't see a way that goals could help with that. And that in fact there needed to be trust established first in order for them to even feel able to talk about goals. And that was a contradictory finding to the literature. So we found that through goal setting, young people said that being given a choice over what happens to them and what they work on and the areas that they want to focus in on in terms of outcomes, being given that choice leads to a sense of autonomy and control over what happens to them and their own care. They also said that feeling goal setting and collaboratively working on goals with their practitioners helps them to feel involved in the therapeutic process, and that leads them to feel more engaged as well. So it's that being a part of it and being part of something that's happening to you, and it's not something that's being done to you. Young people also said that they value splitting actions into smaller manageable steps, and in doing so receive encouragement from practitioners and validation that their goals are achievable. So for whom? So when turning to what was considered unhelpful in terms of goal setting, all of the aspects were related to specific personality traits or elements of anxiety and depression. And so this included things like high levels of stress, trauma, experiences of trauma, low confidence, feelings of hopelessness, negative past experiences of goal setting, and it didn't matter within what context or what sorts of goals they'd set before, and also rumination. So from all of this work and these discussions, it really sort of came out that it's something about the person that wasn't necessarily tangible. So it's, you know, and this came from both the youth advisors and the practitioners when we spoke to them. They said it's just about preferences, and we couldn't really in those conversations determine what it is about a person that may or may not mean that they want to set goals, or whether it's helpful or unhelpful. It seemed to be a combination of factors, could be some of these factors that I've identified here, but everything was linked back to those preferences, and I think this links us back to the first study as well. We also found that the nature of difficulties is important only some of the time, and the advisors didn't want to separate out anxiety and depression. So that was a common theme across both of our studies as well. So both the professionals and the youth advisors said, no, let's not talk about anxiety and depression independently, let's talk about it all as one. And when we sort of probed on that a bit, it was the sense that there's so much comorbidity anyway, we may as well talk about it all as one. So we determined that levels of distress, personality traits and preferences must be considered when talking about working on goals with young people who experience anxiety and depression. The results from one study that was included in this literature review also demonstrated that young people on the lower end of the age range of interest for these studies, so young people who are around about 15 years old, may have developmental factors that limit their ability to want to form therapeutic relationships anyway. And so that would be a limiting factor in thinking about goal setting as part of a relationship. In what contexts? So the included studies suggested that goal setting was an effective element of the therapeutic relationship within their contexts, which did include quite a wide range of types of support and settings. But all of those included studies were located in Western high-income countries. So we can broadly say that young people in Western high-income countries largely have agency to set goals. However, we also found that culture, country and therapy context are extremely important and potentially limiting factors. So we've pulled out 2 examples here that came out of the literature and were discussed at some length with the advisors that we also spoke to. So one was long-term therapy, and as I previously mentioned, it was determined that reviewing progress too frequently might give the impression that the practitioner is more interested in gauging their own success, and therefore those ratings on the goal-based outcomes tool or whatever other goal rating scale is being used, those ratings then become meaningless to the young person. And the limiting factors that surrounded long-term therapy were twofold, and this came out quite strongly from the youth advisors that we spoke to. So in one way, they said that when being referred for long-term therapy, the young person's likely to have multiple difficulties, have experienced trauma, and so therefore trying to order thoughts to be able to think about what their goals might be was challenging. In addition to that, there was this idea that the long-term therapy is a period of time that's stretched out in front of them, and therefore it was difficult to think about and distill their thoughts in relation to what they want to work on, and what they would want to work on for this long period of time. It just felt too long to be able to set meaningful goals. And then the other context that was discussed at some length as well was this idea of not recognizing difficulties that have been identified when referred for support by someone else. So often parents and carers will refer young people for support with their difficulties, and so it was determined that that would be a limiting factor, because obviously recognizing the difficulties is key to be able to set goals around that. So Milos is going to talk us through the insights from the youth advisors specifically.
Yes, I just see a message from Marta that we have 7 more minutes, so I'll try to be as short as possible. So youth advisors agree that the goal setting can be and has been beneficial to those young people who experience anxiety or depression in a range of contexts. And the most prominent helpful elements were goals being a channel for open communication and allowing young people to feel in control of their own care, as well as being beneficial to help break things down into manageable steps, as we were mentioning before. However, there were some contexts within young people were mentioning that that in their experience, goal setting was not helpful, and those can be country specific. For example, in Pakistan, often the decisions about the therapy are made by the family instead of by a young person itself. And some characteristics of the therapy, like long-term therapy that Jenna was just elaborating on, complexity of difficulties and the length of support were some of the limiting factors. There was also important element related to language, because young people often associate goals with something that is more school or work related, while therapeutic goals have some more personal and significant meaning. And so they very much highlighted the importance around the use of language in this topic. And finally, youth advisors said that the most important element for them is open communication and the trust with the practitioners. And they believe that before working on the goals, the trust and the relationship with the therapist should be built, because they felt that they will be able to share goals with the therapist only and when the relationship has been established, and everything before that wouldn't make sense or would feel as a pressure or something that is pre-decided, and they wouldn't have a lot of say in it.
So So recommendations for practice. So we identified a number of gaps in the literature. So for example, relationships in youth settings. So much of the literature is focused on adults and adult therapeutic relationships, adult therapeutic alliance. There are also a lot of studies that were included in our initial searches, so those 10,000 sources of information, and there was a load there, but they only partially spoke to our research questions. So they were either just about goal setting or just about therapeutic relationships, but less, you know, there wasn't much at all that spoke to therapeutic relationships with young people within this context. And so a lack of evidence may suggest that goal setting is not embedded in service standards or practice in most contexts around the world, or it may be indicative of other limiting factors such as a general underfunding of youth mental health research. And particularly the thing that struck me was the fact that those studies that we were able to include, all of them came from Western high income countries. So there's a huge research gap there. Our recommendation is that preferences to not work on goals may be driven by some of the limiting factors that we've identified and I've spoken about, such as hopelessness or high levels of distress. And there's a key role for practitioners to work through this first, reviewing the option to work on goals over time, given that there are notable elements of goal setting that have been identified as helpful. So if across the board it's helpful, I think it's useful to check in with that young person who initially doesn't want to work on goals and to see how that decision is going, I suppose. Another recommendation is that young people owning the goals is essential, and particularly when experiencing depression at a time where, you know, there may be feeling a lack of purpose, where things are not structured, that type of thing. And goals may facilitate work with young people experiencing high levels of distress or trauma due to the role of goals in building trusting and open relationships. And so this, I think, is a key recommendation for us, because what we had read and what had come out was all about the challenges of goal setting with young people who experience high levels of distress or who've had multiple complex trauma. But we feel as though there's a unique opportunity here to work with those young people, given that the evidence suggests that goal setting is facilitative in building trusting relationships, which we know is so important in the work with those young people. And so finally here, there's just to say many thanks to all of the advisors and the other colleagues who made this study possible. And so in terms of next steps, this is the
Hi, I'm sorry, I started with an apology about presenting this as a recording, and I'm going to end with an apology that we didn't have time for thoughts and reflections and questions. I can see that there are a number of things in the chat, and so I will get to those and try to respond to all of the questions that have been raised in the chat. I hope that this has been informative for you, yeah, I look forward to engaging with you on these topics more. Thank you so much everyone for attending, and my apologies again that we're out of time.